Hogwarts Legacy was deeply compromised on Switch 1. Across the board, it suffered from comprehensive downgrades relative to the other versions, with simplified assets, decimated visual settings, poor image quality, and shaky performance. For discerning players, the technical experience just wasn't good enough. Nintendo's brand new Switch 2 promises a generational uplift in hardware capability, however, and has received a much improved Legacy port. But exactly how does it stack up against its Switch 1 counterpart? And where does it fall on the current to last gen console quality continuum? Hogwarts Legacy on Switch 2 is a colossal improvement over its Switch 1 version. Firstly, the game's lighting has been restored to something that more recognizably looks like Hogwarts Legacy. Expect respectable-looking GI, sophisticated SSAO, a greater use of shadow maps, and more environmental light sources. It's almost hard to directly compare the two versions here. There's a generational split in the character of the game's lighting. There are iterative bumps in lighting fidelity, like improved shadow map resolution, and more fundamental shifts, like the introduction of screen space reflections on bodies of water and other glossy surfaces. That SSR is married on the lake here, with crisscrossing normal maps, to represent water ripples in a more convincing fashion. Deeply tied to the game's lighting, of course, is the lighting response of its materials, and that's greatly improved on Switch 2. Surfaces generally have a richer appearance with obvious specularity and surface imperfections, properties that are generally less clear or absent entirely on Switch 1. Wood has an appropriate sheen, metals are pitted and dented, and cloth scatters light convincingly. Asset quality overall has taken a huge leap. Again, expect some iterative bumps, the more liberal application of polygons on one asset, or some extra clutter in a scene, alongside full asset swaps. Exteriors are the most obviously affected, given that they were heavily remodeled and simplified for the Switch 1, while interiors are more recognizable, but still hugely upgraded. Foliage was also reworked for the Switch 1, which is another point of divergence between the platforms. There are some structural differences between the dueling Switches here as well. Switch 1 occluded certain views with revised environmental geometry, presumably as a RAM and GPU sparing measure. Some of these views are restored on Switch 2, like this lakeside rotunda. Loading times between sections of the world are typically eliminated on Switch 2, with no wait to enter Hogsmeade, and no loading screens when entering or exiting shops. Sometimes you'll see a brief loading animation before a door will open, but it's unobtrusive. Expect a big divergence in image quality as well. Hogwarts Legacy on Switch 1 had a pretty raw look without the benefit of TAA, and had a typical resolution around 720p. Legacy really needs a temporal technique to clean up its detailed geometry, long environmental views, and screen space effects, and the original Switch version looked very messy. Switch 2 counts at 720p in every shot I tested, curiously enough, but resolves a higher resolution, relatively stable image with the help of DLSS. I don't have an exact pixel count here, but the final resolve subjectively looks 1080p-like when the camera is still. DRS for that internal resolution is possible here, but I didn't spot it in my tests. It does seem likely to be a less capable, cheaper DLSS variant though, as it doesn't have much in common with PC DLSS and appears more akin to the DLSS variant used in Fast Fusion. The character of its breakup and edge detail mimics that title, and the game's Japanese publisher also claimed DLSS is in play, but it still manages to produce a vastly better looking image than Switch 1. On Switch 1, Hogwarts Legacy players could expect a wobbly 30 FPS, with a torrent of dropped frames and stutters. Hogsmeade was the worst affected of any major area, but few sections were stable for longer than a few seconds. On Switch 2, expect a flatter turnout, with framerates that generally hold at 30 FPS. There are some momentary exceptions, little one-off dropped frames during traversal, and more significant stutters while flying on broomsticks, but I don't feel like these distract too much. Switch 1 and Switch 2 look and run remarkably differently for two versions of the same game. There's a clear generational divide here, and the new version of Hogwarts Legacy is actually something I can recommend. In handheld mode, you can expect a similar presentation, except that internal resolution is cut back to about 540p typically, with DRS kicking in sometimes. Output res looks to be about 1080p, with DLSS again the likely upscaler of choice. I think this DLSS setup is a little more flattering in portable play, where you really appreciate its sharpness on the Switch 2's display. Without DLSS in use here, we'd likely be looking at a much muddier image that wouldn't really hold up all that well on a 1080p panel. Frame rates remain in similar bounds, with good but not faultless 30 FPS performance. Out of curiosity, I also briefly explored the Switch 1 code running on Switch 2. All the frame rate drops have been cleared up, but the game has an intermittent animation stutter that repeats on roughly a 2-second interval while traversing the environment, which should be fairly obvious in this footage. It's a bit reminiscent of Arkham Knight, which also logs a stable 30 FPS, but has serious inconsistency in animation over time. The Switch 1 version of Hogwarts Legacy has been easily dispatched, but what about PS4? This console was home to the most popular of the game's last-gen editions, and generally delivered a competent version of the game. Between these two versions, there's an enormous amount in common. Lighting, assets, and basic visual settings generally correspond here. Up until now, there have been essentially 3 versions of Hogwarts Legacy: Switch 1, last-gen console, and current-gen console and PC, and Switch 2 closely corresponds to the game on last-gen consoles, including PS4. That's not to say it's one-to-one though. Textures are sometimes higher res on Switch 2 for instance, like this lion statue or this table. Foliage though is typically a bit patchier on Switch 2 than on Sony's 12-year-old console. That's a consistent difference we find throughout these comparison shots. Plus, there are a collection of odd, seemingly one-off differences favoring the PS4 version in these shots. This scene is missing some of the self-shadows on the main character, for instance. In this shot, the Switch 2 doesn't have the great baked shadow, and there's a missing specular highlight on this floor surface here. Image quality doesn't have a clear victor either. Switch 2 presents a consistently more stable, sharper image in static shots, with DLSS turning in a stronger result than PS4's TAA plus FSR1 combo. Sony's last-gen juggernaut tends to flicker a little excessively in comparison. The actual internal resolutions favor PS4, with about an 864p pixel count compared to the Switch 2's 720p, but the on-screen result is superior on Nintendo's new system. The exception to this rule are screen space reflections, which DLSS seems to reconstruct poorly. Specular detail has a patchy, noise-ridden appearance, exposing checkerboard-like artifacts in the SSR resolve. Maybe this technique needed an implementation rethink to accommodate the version of DLSS in Switch 2. In motion though, DLSS tends to suffer pronounced issues with image breakup in foliage and in recently disoccluded detail. Unreal's TAA isn't exactly perfect here either, but it tends to fail a little more elegantly than DLSS. Again, the version of DLSS that's likely in use here doesn't offer the same quality as DLSS 2, 3, or 4 on PC, and tends to break apart obviously when you present it with any more challenging upscale scenario. It's somewhat similar to the issues we find in Fast Fusion, albeit blunted here by higher internal resolution and slower gameplay. Overall, I'd say image quality is fairly equivocal in docked mode at least. The two consoles look quite different, but trade off along a number of axes. Performance is also closely matched. PS4 logs a steady 30 FPS in the content I tested, but suffers from occasional dropped frames. Sony's last-gen base console does seem to run slightly more consistently at that 30 FPS target than Switch 2 manages, however, with a more stable run of play in Hogwarts in particular. As an aside, there is one odd issue with the Switch 2 version of Hogwarts Legacy in SDR that I need to touch on. Switch 2 is consistently darker than PS4, with crushed blacks and matching shots on their default brightness settings. It looks almost like using full-range RGB on a TV meant to use limited-range RGB, though I have both consoles set to limited range here. I've adjusted the brightness to approximately match the Switch 2 and the other consoles in this video, which is close to an in-game brightness level at roughly this value, but this seems incorrect and should probably be fixed. If we move up a console generation and look at the Series S, we get a more full-throated Hogwarts Legacy experience. There are all kinds of asset tweaks, both iterative and categorical. This octagonal table is swapped for a perfectly rounded replacement, for instance. These changes usually look fine enough on Switch 2, but there are some odd alterations, like the removal of the animal skull on the 3 broomstick signage, which leaves an inexplicable gap on Switch 2 and PS4. Clearly the game's artwork was designed for current-gen consoles primarily, then adapted for the weaker machines. In addition to the various asset tweaks, expect a much richer foliage presentation on Series S than PS4 or Switch 2, with dense greenery that stretches well into the distance. Volumetric lighting also appears in interior scenes, whereas on the weaker consoles it's typically missing. Shadow map resolution also gets a hike, with shadow silhouettes visibly sharper on Series S. I'd also venture that image quality is better on Series S, which looks similar to PS4 in general, but is a little bit sharper and cleaner with about a 1080p internal resolution. Expect a close to locked 30 FPS on Series S as well, clearing the slightly more wobbly performance on Nintendo's latest. Series S also has a higher framerate 60 FPS performance mode, but it suffers from inconsistent camera travel from frame to frame and is a poor experience in my opinion. This is an issue that wasn't present in the game's launch code and really needs to be resolved. Finally, the world on Series S is built a little bit more coherently than Switch 2 or PS4. There are still loading times that separate Hogwarts from the open world, loading times that are eliminated on Series X, PS5, and PS5 Pro consoles. But in-world loading pauses are eliminated on Series S, which tend to pop up on the weaker machines when traversing between rooms in Hogwarts or buildings in Hogsmeade. Plus, some views that are blocked off on Switch 2 and PS4 are open on Series S. Note how these two walkways are blocked off on Switch 2, which occludes the surrounding world when you walk through them. On Series S, these walkways are totally open. PS4 has all three walkways enclosed, including the walkway the shot is normally captured from, so it's the worst off of the bunch. We have to employ photo mode to get a peek at the other enclosed paths. I also tested loading times briefly across PS4, Series S, and Switch 2. There's a pretty clear pattern here. Switch 2 takes about twice as long as Series S, and then PS4 takes twice as long again as Switch 2. The Switch 2 has very fast storage and dedicated decompression hardware, which may be in use, but packs a very conservatively clocked CPU relative to Series S. Hogwarts Legacy isn't a particularly quick loading title even on current-gen consoles though, so in the future it'll be interesting to see how these loading splits look when comparing SSD-optimized games. Switch 2 delivers a generally competent version of Hogwarts Legacy. Relative to the prior console versions of the game, we're clocking in with an overall visual experience in docked mode that hews closely to PS4 in terms of basic visual settings, with divergent but qualitatively similar results in image quality. It's not a one-to-one match by any means, but broadly speaking, these two versions of the game are essentially equal. The current-gen console versions, even represented by the relatively weak Series S, clear the Switch 2 by some margin. Despite its smaller RAM pool, the S packs higher quality assets, and has a broad range of settings upgrades across the board. I don't think gamers necessarily expected Switch 2 to match Microsoft's junior current-gen console, but it does fall behind by some margin, even if it remains impressive for a svelte hybrid console. Switch 2 though scores an unequivocal win relative to Switch 1, which has a much more primitive rendition of the game that was rebuilt to work effectively on Nintendo's aged hybrid. That's probably the more relevant point of comparison for Switch enthusiasts, and I find it much easier to recommend the Switch 2 version of the game. There's a generational gulf in visual quality favoring Switch 2. So I'd say the port of Hogwarts Legacy for Switch 2 satisfies, even if it doesn't necessarily exceed pre-launch expectations. Franchise fans will find a lot to like here. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfinder.net for exclusive and early access content and to get in touch to use social media. Thanks for watching.